So we will turn it open to questions or comments. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask two questions. Dave, you said that there's no single solution. However, I was told in reading the newspaper that a prominent official from the East Coast, when he was visiting the campfire area with the governor and governor-elect, said if we would just do a better job of raking our forest, the problem would go away. Is that not correct?
Yes, I forgot to mention that. Yes, we're all busy raking. No, of course not. We all struggle with that comment.
You don't have to elaborate on it.
No, clearly there needs to be a lot more work done, and everybody does recognize that. But it is a collaborative effort across local, state, and federal lands. So there is ownership issues with different land management policies backing them. And that's always a challenge to try to merge all of those into a cohesive whole because, as we all know, fires just pay absolutely no attention to those dotted lines on a map someplace.
And it's possible we need to do more work getting our elected officials to understand basic principles, but that's a topic for another conversation.
Well, maybe I just would add one thing. I think it's really important when we're thinking about treatments to also really think about what the objectives of the treatments are. And I think Don kind of alluded to this yesterday a little bit, that often we're thinking about reducing fuels, but what does that really mean? And are we actually reducing the fuels, or are we just rearranging the fuels? So if we don't actually follow up with burning or somehow removing material, then we're just rearranging the size and shape and where those are located. And so, we can rake them into piles, but are we going to burn those piles? We really need to follow up with an application of fire.
So in somewhat a more serious vein, Dr. Baum's just left, or I was going to put him on a spot, but what do you tell a community like the Berkeley Hills or the community of Berkeley, for those of you who haven't been on the north side of Berkeley? Steep hills, lots of houses packed closely together, basically single lane roads that are cluttered with vehicles along the side, but homes that actually aren't cheap by any standard. What do you tell a community like that based on the experiences that you have? And they're not unique by any means.
No, they're not unique. And of course, everyone probably remembers the fire in 1991, the tunnel fire that burned in the Oakland Hills. It was relatively small. It was only 1,600 acres, which in our world is not a large fire. But it dropped ash across the bay while the 49ers were playing football. Of course, it only lasted for about 8 hours, but it burned about 3,000 structures down and tragically killed 25 people. So the Oakland-Berkeley Hills has a history. As I showed in a couple of slides of the history maps of fires repeating themselves, largely in the same locations over and over and over again, the Oakland-Berkeley Hills has had a long history of fires. There was a very famous fire in Berkeley in 1924 that was one of the very first fires that burned over 400 homes down in Berkeley coming out of the hills. Very, very similar footprint, very close to where the 1991 fire was. But in 1924, of course, most everything was wooden with wood shake roofs. And that was one of the very first recognitions that maybe wood shake roofs are not such a great idea. And they started going away. But I would put money on the fact that another fire in the Oakland-Berkeley Hills is only a matter of time. It's not if, it's only a matter of when. And people should recognize the knowledge that we have from science and research today, understanding how they can take steps to better protect their properties through vegetation management, as well as home hardening. And if everyone were to do that in a successful way, I think you've got a real chance of reducing the risk of structures and lives, and actually probably having fewer homes lost the next time it comes around.
How do you incentivize a community like that to do the things that you're talking about?
Everybody has insurance. Well, not everybody, but I would argue that the vast majority of people with those high-cost homes in the Oakland Hills probably do. I'm doing a lot of work with the insurance industry right now, and I'll be honest, wildfires, I've spoken to a couple of people about this. The insurance industry really came out of the woodwork with what's going on in the last few years. I have been absolutely amazed at how little the insurance industry truly understands the wildfire condition. But if you think about them on a global scale, wildfires have never been a large dollar loss for them. They have looked at wind events, hurricanes, tornadoes, water events, flooding, those kind of things on a global scale that are great losses. And in fact, I had one insurance company tell me that a bad hailstorm in Dallas on a summer afternoon can cause more damage than all their wildfire losses for an entire year. But that was only until just a few years ago. And over the last 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 at most, wildfires have now risen extremely rapidly to the top of their list. And they are struggling to catch up and understand. And if it's one thing that we understand about the insurance industries, they are for-profit companies. And they have been caught off guard and surprised about this, and they don't understand it as well as they'd like to. They're struggling hard to come up with new modeling. I think it's safe to say that across the country, because wildfires have been historically a very low risk for them, the cost of wildfire insurance has been artificially kept low for a very long time because they subsidized it with the cost of other insurance. I think that is all going to change very, very, very rapidly here. And we're going to see companies start taking on more realistic cost of insurance. So I think it's going to go up for everybody, but that's just the cost of business. And but they're going to learn, and they're all learning how to go out and look at these individual structures on a much more detailed level than they ever have before. So I think there's going to be some incentive on homeowners to do that. And I would like our elected officials to really gather the political will to incentivize people and think about our land use planning policies of where we're building, what materials we're building with, and so on and so forth. So I think we're in that change, but it's still going to take a little time.
Michelle?
Yeah, maybe I would just add, I think there's also kind of a carrot side to that. And I think that people, there are lots of people who I think want to know what they can do to keep themselves and their families safe. And so I think that there are many programs out there that will help people figure out what actions they can take, how to meet their neighbors. There's sort of some basic community organizing that we need to be doing around these issues. And so there's both the stuff we want people to do that we're trying to get them to act on, and then there's the stuff they want to do where we could just give them some information. And I think that we have tremendous opportunity especially with some of these big tragic fires where we have some attention to say, hey, here's some things you can do that will help you. You can create a block captain system. We do have communications go down in fires, and we can do things to bolster those, but it would be really great to actually know who your neighbors are and be able to communicate with them verbally. I think we need to rely on some of the old-fashioned kind of techniques of relying on ourselves and our neighbors and becoming literate in how fire behavior works and making sure that we're taking responsibility for ourselves.
It occurs to me that in thinking about places like the Berkeley and Oakland Hills, that concepts of herd immunity, which we use in vaccination, would apply. Because, if half of the homes do something about it, it's not going to be adequate. That you really have to have a community-wide response. Yes, someone, yes, in the back.
Still on? Yeah. I think this question is for Dave. This is sort of personal interest. You've touched on it, which is home hardening. So I grew up in Reading. I had my father, cousin, several friends lose their homes in the Carr Fire. And many of them are rebuilding. They all live in the wildland-urban interface and are rebuilding in that area. And I've seen the cycle of fire come through and retreat and come through and retreat many times. And I'm wondering, is there anything in the building code, I asked Annie about this with Washington, is there anything in the building code that's going to require them to build to a higher standard in terms of hardening the homes? Is that going to be something that I'm hearing people are having a hard time getting insurance as well. If they live in the same area, they can't even get their homes insured anymore. And I was just wondering if you had any comment about that.
Yes, California is the only state in the country that has what we call the WUI codes, the Wildland Urban Interface Codes. It's Chapter 7A in the state building code, and it is required that structures built in the what is called the high and very high fire hazard severity zones. Those maps identify where those high and very high risk areas are across the state, and structures built in those zones are required to use the WUI codes. However, the science is rapidly overshadowing. The WUI codes were put into place in 2008 in the state of California. There is a lot of talk about changing them. As everybody can really imagine, the state legislature and the governor's office is on overdrive right now. The number of bills and legislation downtown here at the Capitol is pretty overwhelming with bills trying to discuss these issues. But insurance, contrary to a lot of what you might read or hear in the news, is that the insurance industry is not leaving California. There are many companies who are actually looking to come in. And yes, it's going to change the equations, and costs are probably going to go up. But people will be looking at it because the way that the insurance companies are looking at their risk management, their assessments have been done on very large landscape scale assessments for decades. And they're all recognizing the fact that that is not efficient enough to deal with the problems that we have today. And there's a lot of new companies out there that are dealing with new technologies and new risk assessment models that the insurance companies will be buying into and have already started to really look at properties on an individual parcel level scale and give homeowners a snapshot of what they can do to improve their homes and things like that. I would also say that from a rebuilding standpoint, much of what you see being rebuilt out there is the same thing that just burned down. I was on a fire in 2003, the old fire in San Bernardino, as a strike team leader, and about 400 homes that burned down in the old fire in San Bernardino were homes that had been rebuilt after the 1981 Panorama fire in the exact same location. And only 22 years later, another 400 of those homes burned down again. So if we continue to do the same thing we've always done, you know what it is, the definition of insanity. I think we need to look at new things, and there's new companies, there's new technology, there's new research showing different types of building materials that are highly fire resistant that we should be paying a lot more attention to, and really thinking about changing the paradigm of the way we've always done business. But of course that requires the contractors and builders to really change the way they're doing business too. But it has to happen for us to be more resilient in these fire-prone areas.
I just want to add one thing about Reading that's a particular opportunity. I know that the city of Reading is partnering with a national program called the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire Program, which comes in and helps advise different jurisdictions about their codes and ordinances. And so they're actually undergoing a whole year-long process right now. They kicked off in September. Reading was selected prior to the Carr fire occurring. And so they're now sort of thinking about it with that additional context. But so there's an opportunity if your family members or just anyone you know in Reading wants to be engaged in a conversation around what codes and ordinances should look like. That's going to be going on this year.
Question over here.
Sure. Hi, my name is Maggie Robbins. I'm with a little NGO called WorkSafe. So I come from the occupational health side of the equation here, and unfortunately I was unable to be here yesterday, so maybe this was talked about more yesterday. But I haven't been hearing much today about occupational health elements here. It was mentioned in the Washington presentations, and I appreciated that. But it's really just a question of when people are doing their planning and looking back at past fire response, and does anybody have their eye on the ball about what's happening to the people doing the response? And I don't mean just firefighters. Clearly that's a high-risk zone, and we do at least tally the deaths from that. It's not clear it goes beyond that. But there's all sorts of people engaged in response that are from the phone companies to, power companies to the utilities of other kinds. There's the people who are doing evacuations. There's the people evacuating hospitals, like in Santa Rosa. There's lots of people out there that are being put to work in these zones. And I'm wondering, does anybody actually focusing on that, or is there sort of an assumption that, well, their employer makes sure they're safe? Because I think it's an invalid assumption. And I would hope that in planning that there's being more kind of intentional thought about ways to premeditate about this and not have it be a repetition of disaster after disaster where the response workers get seriously ill or injured in the process.
Yeah, actually, we spent quite a bit of time yesterday where that was brought in one way or another.
Glad to hear it. Thank you.
And did have some specific presentation on first responders, as well as touching on several of the other groups in various ways. David, did you have your?
Thank you. I've had a lot of questions the last 2 days, and I think that's because it's such an exciting conference. I'd like to ask the panel to speculate for a moment. What's really impressed me is the disconnect between how much science has been done on sort of the stuff that Dave Hsu presented, and then also how much community action has become sophisticated and evolved, as Michelle presented. And on the other hand, it's just starting to get mainstreamed in public health, as witnessed by the fact that we're here just now, and that Nicole is setting up one of the first institutions in a public health school to think about wildland fires. And so what might be, for those of you, who, I would imagine this is mostly for David and Michelle, who have traveled nationally on this topic, what might you speculate are the reasons for the disconnect between wildland fires climbing higher on our agenda as a nation? Is it simply just the insurance losses, or is it other things, rurality versus urbanicity of events, the fact that it occurs in western states, not eastern states, perceptions of who is harmed, not harmed? Our pictures show, not to pick on you, Michelle, but pictures show white, happy people, which doesn't have the same pulling at media strings as other media-focused disasters. So any perception on that would be really, any speculations on that would be really interesting.
Nicole, do you want to take a shot at that?
I can start, but I think that part of it is that we as a health community have been behind in disaster science for a long time compared to other types of health research. But I also think that the health impacts of these wildfires hasn't been experienced because we haven't had as many urban interface wildfires before as we are having right now. And so there's a lot more people impacted, and that becomes something that's easier to study, especially the smoke impacts that are happening across larger areas that give us more statistical power to do epidemiological studies that maybe we haven't had in the past. But I would be interested in hearing what you guys think about how the broader interest is being brought to the bear.
Sure. I think you're mostly right. You mentioned the fact that the frequency and the large perception is it's a Western United States problem. However, of course, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, I don't think anybody expected that, although there is quite a history there, actually. In the lower 48 states, the largest fire in recorded history in the United States and in the continental U.S. was actually in Wisconsin. It was in 1872, called the Peshtigo Fire. It occurred the very same morning that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern in the barn in Chicago and caused the Great Chicago Fire. And because of the Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire largely went unnoticed. It's assumed that many thousands of people died in that fire, but no one really knows. They didn't have good census numbers in 1872 in Wisconsin. But it still today is the largest recorded fire in history, in recorded history in the United States. So the fire potential is always there. in many, many places. There's fires in all 50 states have had fires. But I'll tell you, I grew up in Indiana, and my family in Indiana pretty much could care less about this subject because it doesn't happen there with any rate of frequency. So they don't think of it as a problem. I think looking at the statistics here in the Western United States, and I'm talking Texas, Colorado, all these places, it's happening with such frequency and with such magnitude at this point that we simply do not have the luxury of ignoring it any longer. And the potential, I've been asked 1,000 times, where's the next paradise? And I would give you a list of 1,000 places that it could be this summer. And I have quit saying that that's the worst I could see. Throughout my entire career, I'd go to these fires and say, oh, that's the worst I'll ever see. I'll never see anything else like that again. And then I saw something worse, and then I saw something worse. And in 2017, living in Napa, going through the fires there, I even said, that's it, I'll never see anything worse than this. And then less than a year later, Paradise burns down. So I'm done saying that that's the worst we'll ever see. I'm totally convinced that Paradise is not the worst we'll ever see. It will be worse. I'm completely convinced of that because the historic progress of this indicates that we have nothing else to expect. It would be an anomaly if somehow it just suddenly dropped off the screen. And none of our data or statistics indicates that that's going to be the case. So I think that we do not have the luxury of time or the ability to ignore it any longer. And that's why I'm hoping the elected officials, the insurance industry, everybody, this is a major paradigm shift that is happening right before our eyes. And I'm hoping conferences like this will bring more and more people on board with it because the spectrum that it's impacting is not just the residents whose homes are burning down, but as we've talked about the last couple days, millions of people elsewhere nearby.
So Michelle, you get the last comment.
Well, I would definitely agree with Dave that I think we can't expect that the worst is behind us, but I think we should still be hopeful. So I want to make sure we say that. Like, I think it's really hard. It's really hard to look, to kind of think about the outlook, think about the amount of exposure that we actually have and understand the science. But it is, what I think can help counteract that is that over the last 6 years of us running this network, I have definitely seen a major shift in the conversations that are happening in the communities across the country that we're working with. People recognize that what we're doing is not working and we need to adopt some new strategies. And so recognition of that, I think, can lead to some change. And I think the other thing that has really changed in terms of what people are taking action around is that people are realizing that just thinking about one slice of the pie, just thinking about evacuation, just thinking about home hardening, those are critical things and they're absolutely assets to protect. But if we want to really make that paradigm shift, we have to be thinking about our whole system and how our economic factors are being brought into play. We have to really take a broad view of how do we want to live as people on a landscape? What do we want community to mean to us? How do we want to relate to each other? How do we want to relate to the natural processes that are shaping our environment? And I think that's the key question. And if we ask that and think about all of the things we can do to affect that, it gives me some hope at least.